Carolyn, and thank you to the city and the county league for inviting me to be a part of this program today. I am a member of the League of Women Voters and served on the board of the county league for a couple of years previously. So today I'm going to show my screen here. We're going to talk about the importance of open space in inner suburbs and cities. And in particular, look at the question of green infrastructure, which is more than just parks. Just bear with me for 1 second here while I've got multiple screens, so I've got to get this straightened out. So this is the head of Bear Creek in Dundalk, Maryland, where in September of 1814, a group of Maryland militia fought bravely to keep the British from traveling up the North Point Peninsula to Baltimore and burning that city, just as they had burned Washington, D.C. a month earlier. Neighborspace is working on a trail project there that would help to tell that story, provide a much needed recreational amenity, and connect a water trail, along with several parks and schools. But because Baltimore County has not previously valued trails highly in recreational planning or budgeting, it has been a challenging 10-year struggle to advance the project, although the present administration has been helpful. As we shall see, the need to think about open space networks within our inner suburbs and the cities they surround, connecting people to nature and to important commercial and cultural hubs, is fundamental to their livability. But first, what do I mean by inner suburbs? Inner suburbs are the jurisdictions that share a border with America's largest and oldest cities. There are over 50 such jurisdictions around the country, including places like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Boston, Chicago, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and Atlanta, just to name a few, all places we will visit in this presentation. Collectively, the inner suburbs are home to 1/5 of America. Most developed along radial routes leading outside of the city. In Chicago, the radials were often rail lines, as shown here in the plan for the inner suburb of Riverside, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1868, and straddling the tracks of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which runs right through the middle of the subdivision. For Baltimore and many other cities, those radials were initially streetcar lines, connecting the city to Dundalk, Parkville, Towson, Pikesville, and Catonsville. The same was true for suburbs in Boston, connecting downtown Boston to places like Everett, Medford, and Arlington, as well as those in Los Angeles. Here is the streetcar map for 1941, making connections to places like Glendale, Beverly Hills, and Culver City. But streetcars, in spite of the fact that they operated cleanly and moved large numbers of people efficiently and affordably, were a short-lived phenomenon in the United States, ultimately dominated by the automobile. Understanding this transportation history is key to understanding the livability challenges of the present day and why green networks are so important as a remedy. Let me explain. Cars early on were handmade and expensive, the bastion of the wealthy. But assembly line techniques made them increasingly more and more affordable for the masses. The Model T sold for $850 in 1908 and actually went down in price by 20% 4 years later. Automobile registrations skyrocketed. And as they became more affordable, more and more people clamored for the freedom they offered. At the same time, the real estate industry saw the possibilities the automobile offered for developing places not served by rail lines. This led to massive road building efforts. Federal road acts in 1916 and 1921 sought to improve roads and link them to a national network. By 1925, a national system of numbered routes was adopted, and highway spending topped $1 billion. It is about then that we begin to see suburban growth rates outpace those of cities. At about the same time, we see the rise of Euclidean or traditional zoning. Today, zoning laws determine what can be built where. The right of governments to make such determinations stems from a 1920 era dispute in which Euclid, an inner suburb of Cleveland, prevented Ambler Realty from developing an industrial use in an area that the town had determined should be residential. Ambler sued, claiming that the town's actions had substantially reduced the value of its land without due process of law. In 1926, the Supreme Court weighed in, saying, no, the town was right to use its constitutional police power to protect the public from the adverse impacts of development. Under this scheme, all of the uses in this diagram must be separate from one another. You can't put apartments over top of a store, for example. Traditional zoning proliferated across the landscape following the Euclid case. It's why nearly all the first-tier suburbs in Baltimore County have a walk score that translates as car dependent. You can't easily walk from your house, a residential use, in most places, to a commercial use like a store or restaurant. So in the diagram, all of the first-tier suburbs in the county are shown, and those that are red get the low score, 0 to 24, meaning car dependent. There are a couple that are yellow, like Parkville, where I live, that are somewhat walkable, but most are car dependent. At about the same time that these zoning activities were laying a foundation for what the future suburbs would look like, big business seized on an opportunity to ensure that they were only reachable by car. In 1925, General Motors acquired the Yellow Coach Company, undertaking a systematic campaign to put streetcar lines out of business all over America. Through a network of subsidiaries, GM used its financial muscle to buy up streetcar lines, scrap the tracks, and convert the routes to buses. In 1943, GM and its part suppliers combined to convert trolleys to buses in 19 cities, including those in Los Angeles. In 1949, a federal grand jury indicted GM for criminal conspiracy in the case, but the eventual fine of $5,000 was too small to be much of a deterrent. By 1950, General Motors had converted more than 100 electric streetcar lines to gasoline-powered buses. The ultimate goal, of course, was to replace public transportation with cars to allow automobiles to proliferate. It is a story I hate to tell because GM put a lot of food on my family's table over time. My grandfather, Harry Prentice, was twice the plant manager at the GM plant in Baltimore and held that same job in Cincinnati, Ohio, Oakland, California, and Los Angeles. He is in the middle of this photograph from the Baltimore Sun, standing just right of the white car with a handkerchief in his pocket. The 6 millionth to come off the line at the former GM plant on Vernon Highway in Baltimore in 1973. Even during the Great Depression, we kept a focus on building roads to support the automobile. Between 1933 and 1940, federal relief agencies poured $4 billion into roads and streets, putting people to work and getting visible results. Among the notable road builders of the time was Robert Moses, chief of a series of New York government agencies. His plans for opening up Long Island, once the bastion of farmers, fishermen, and industrial millionaires to middle-class city dwellers by constructing a vast system of highways are cited as a prototype for highway expansion in suburbs across the country. We shall see shortly that the plan also facilitated the construction of one of the largest mass-produced housing developments the country has ever seen. While road building continued apace during the Great Depression, home building did not. In the years following the stock market crash of 1929, home construction fell by 95%. Bankruptcies escalated, leaving many people looking for housing and leading to the rise of encampments of the homeless, known as Hoovervilles, around the country. When Roosevelt replaced Hoover as president, he created the FHA, which began to guarantee home loans, making it much easier than it ever had been before for the average person to buy a house. This radically transformed home ownership in America, at least for whites. FHA policies redlined many urban areas and discriminated against people of color, making it nearly impossible for them to build wealth through home ownership, a challenge that was particularly bad in Baltimore. The FHA program favored new houses, which were being built where there was vacant land in the inner suburbs. Gas was cheap, and a basic car cost a few $100s, making commuting to work economically affordable. After World War II, the VA also jumped into the Low Interest Loan Act, making it possible for returning servicemen, at least those who were white, to purchase a home with no down payment. These factors fueled demand for housing, a need answered by William Levitt, an entrepreneur who took what he learned about mass production of Navy barracks during World War II and applied it to the home building industry. And you can see this is a photograph of Levittown, which was built on Long Island beginning in 1947. Levitt's houses were simple, uniform, and inexpensive, costing between $8,000 and $9,500. The places so created, however, were far from idyllic. Everything was spread out and hard to get to without a car. There were no cultural institutions. There was little escape from other people into nature, except for a few totemic trees and the banal foundation landscaping. Songwriter Malvina Reynolds called the new form ticky-tacky. Author John Keats called them boxes and fresh air slums around the edges of American cities. Historian Lewis Mumford called these new suburbs an asylum for the preservation of illusion. And journalist Howard Kunstler notes that the main problem with it was that it dispensed with all the traditional connections and continuities of community life and replaced them with little more than cars and television. It is a form that dominates the landscape in the inner suburbs that surround Baltimore City and many other cities across the US today. And the prevalence of that form in Baltimore County also helps to explain why home values are not competitive with those in most other metro jurisdictions. This chart looks at home values between 2012 and 2021. Baltimore County is the dark black line. The top line is Howard County, and the bottom line is Baltimore City. And you can see that this has changed very little over time. It's also why the vast majority of tributaries flowing from the county to the city and on into the Chesapeake Bay. Excuse me, I skipped the slide here. Another challenge with this pattern of development is, unfortunately, that few rules were in place, save traditional zoning, to guide where these new subdivisions were built. Little thought was given to the protection of natural resources, the creation of parks, and the management of stormwater runoff in their vicinity. It is among the reasons why today there is a shortage of open space, as shown here in Baltimore County, where 65% of residences, those within the regions of the map that are orange and yellow, lack access to adequate open space within a quarter-mile walk. And it's also why the vast majority of tributaries flowing from the county to the city and on into the Chesapeake Bay are impaired by nutrients and or sediment from stormwater runoff. By the mid-1950s, there were numerous communities along the arterial roads leading out of the cities, but they were disconnected and clogged by an ever-increasing volume of cars. In 1956, at the behest of then-President Dwight Eisenhower, Congress passed the Interstate Highway Act, paving the way for the development of 41,000 miles of new expressways. It proposed to link up most cities with more than 50,000 inhabitants and included beltways around the largest. The chief political justification was that the new expressways would ease the evacuation of cities in the event of a nuclear attack. With construction beginning in 1957, Baltimore's is the nation's first Eisenhower or defense beltway in the nation. So let's stop and take stock of where this history has left us. The advent of the automobile and the greed it unleashed have led to a lack of open space in neighborhoods, aging and mass-produced housing infrastructure that isn't competitive with modern construction, a degraded environment, and communities that are largely unwalkable and car-centric, factors that are anathema to quality of life. For they are among the factors that have made many inner suburbs unlivable to one degree or another in the United States. This chart shows the livability rankings for roughly 1/3 of the inner suburban jurisdictions across the country, based on the American Association of Retired Persons Livability Index. It is hard to get a high score, even for a brand new suburb on this scale. The best suburbs achieve a score of between 60 and 70, above the red line on this chart. And a difference of only a few points is a big deal. At 50, Baltimore County's first suburbs are at the bottom of the pile, besting only those that surround Louisville, Atlanta, and Detroit. How are the rankings determined? There are 7 categories, and within each, AARP looks for both outcomes on key metrics and the presence of specific state and local policies. Among the metrics are neighborhood, looking at things like proximity to destinations, transportation, looking at how many trips are on foot, environment, looking at air and water quality, and health, looking at the prevalence of obesity and access to exercise opportunities. So if an area doesn't fare well on these outcomes, what can it do? And is open space at least part of the solution? And the answer is that there's a lot of evidence out there that publicly accessible networked open space, not just new parks, done in just the right amounts in just the right places, will indeed contribute to improved livability. Let's look at some of it. David Barth, a well-known planner and landscape architect, argues in a new book that we have to look at streets, bike lanes, sidewalks, greenways, trails, transit, blueways, and utility corridors as a means of connecting people to green hubs, cultural resources, and institutions. Given the level of challenges that exist and increasing scarcity of open space, a whole system approach is needed to better use existing infrastructure to achieve livability, otherwise known as sustainability. This approach has come to be known as green network planning, beefing up the connections that exist with trees and sidewalks, and adding new trails to connect people to existing and new parks, cultural resources, and institutions. So in this diagram, we've beefed up the tree canopy on the street to connect people to this pocket park, to this larger park, and ultimately to this green belt, which presumably surrounds the town. All of this is done with the goal of ensuring that everyone has access to quality open space within a 10-minute walk, as proposed by the grassroots park organization 10minutewalk.org. Why a 10-minute walk? Well, 50% of the population is too old, too young, too poor, or too disabled to get in their car and drive to open space. Is the approach applicable to inner suburbs? I've been criticizing for suggesting that it should be. Well, David Barth, whose book we just mentioned, says it is. Moreover, 26 inner suburban jurisdictions from around the country have signed on to this movement, including 3 in Maryland: College Park, Gaithersburg, and Rockville. Going back to our livability ranking for the inner suburbs, we can see that suburban jurisdictions in Washington, D.C., particularly those in Arlington County, and then on the Maryland side in Montgomery County, as well as Minneapolis, are among those that AARP has determined to be great places, livable places. So that begs the question, do they have robust green networks? And the answer is yes. This map from Rails to Trails shows existing trails in Washington, D.C., and its southern inner suburb of Arlington. Look at the green belt that goes around the city of Arlington and the connection with D.C., where presumably many of Arlington's inhabitants work. Here's a look at one of Arlington's trails, the 19-mile Mount Vernon Trail. Some of you may have had the pleasure of using this trail. It's lovely. This map looks at the extensive connectivity of DC's northern suburbs in Montgomery County with the district. Look at how you can get from Chevy Chase to the district, from Silver Spring to the district, and from College Park to the district. Here's a look at one of those corridors, the Little Falls Trail in Montgomery County. This map looks at the extensive connectivity of the city of Minneapolis with its inner suburbs. Look at the connections from downtown to the inner suburbs of St. Louis Park, Golden Valley, and Robbinsdale. Here's a look at one of those corridors, the North Cedar Lake Regional Trail. Compare the results from the inner suburbs of Arlington, Montgomery County, and Minneapolis with this map of Metro Baltimore. While the city has done some work to create trails, you can see that there are absolutely no connections to the inner ring suburbs in Baltimore County. This indeed does help to explain the county's lower ranking relative to other inner suburbs. And while the city has a robust plan for improving its green infrastructure network, and I would say that the city's plan is probably the best one in Metro Baltimore, Baltimore County has none and is the only urbanized jurisdiction in Metro Baltimore without one. The city's green network plan includes the Baltimore Greenway, a project of Rails to Trails and others that will link 75 neighborhoods and be within a 15-minute walk of half of Baltimore's population. It has goals of promoting social equity, improving health and wellness, protecting the environment, creating alternative transportation options, and promoting economic development. And this trail is going to happen with a large coalition of public and private partners and already $3.5 million in direct investment. What's more, Ernst & Young has tabulated a number of benefits to spending $28 million on the Greenway's completion, including $314 million in property value increases, which equates to roughly $7 million in new property tax revenues for the city, $2.9 million in avoided health costs owing to more walking and biking, environmental impacts equivalent to 430 to 580 fewer cars per year. The fact that other jurisdictions like Fulton County, Georgia, that share a low livability ranking with Baltimore County on our list are improving should be an impetus for the county to act. This slide shows a report analyzing existing regional trails in Metro Atlanta and their gaps. In recent years, Atlanta has done much to add trail connectivity between its inner suburbs and its downtown, including Path 400, connecting Atlanta to inner suburbs in Fulton County. The Atlanta Beltline, which forms a greenway around downtown Atlanta, and has many connecting trails to that city's inner suburbs, cost $559 million to build to date, and has resulted in $4.6 billion in private development, an 8-fold return. Urban trail networks can have significant economic impact as well as health and environmental benefits. Which is in no small part why Path 400, which will connect the inner suburbs of Sandy Springs and Buckhead, which are out here, to downtown Atlanta, down here. 85 is Atlanta's Beltway. And many other trail networks are in the works. And this kind of reminds you of how 83 comes off of 695. And here is this trail, Path 400, going out to the inner suburbs that surround Atlanta. The inner suburbs and the cities they surround are dependent on one another for their ongoing livability. Almost 1.3 million people live in urban Greater Baltimore. Looking at the city's population, those of the inner suburbs in Baltimore County inside the county's urban-rural demarcation line, shown here. Their livability challenges do not respect political boundaries. And their livability scores, again, looking at the AARP Livability Index, are not robust. Again, you see Baltimore County tied with Queen Anne's County in Metro Baltimore for last place. We must insist that our local governments do more individually and collectively with respect to the creation of robust green infrastructure networks if we are to compete locally and nationally for the tax base that will sustain the metro area going forward. A few recommendations. First, plan. Ensure that the comprehensive plans of local governments embrace green network planning and the 10-minute walk. Next, develop green network plans that connect communities to nature, cultural amenities, and commercial and institutional hubs. And finally, ensure that local park master plans support green networks. Partner. We need a range of public and private partners, including nonprofits like land trusts, to be involved in the planning and development of green networks. We need to encourage cooperation between city and county governments, those that are separate sovereigns in particular, like Baltimore City and Baltimore County. We are somewhat unique around the country. In many places like Los Angeles, the city and the county governments are one. Hence, they cooperate. Finally, fund. Use adequate public facilities ordinances and impact fees to ensure that all new development, retail and commercial, contributes to the cost of building green networks. In Baltimore County, we have an adequate public facilities ordinance that is unfortunately not enforced. We allow developers to meet the public facilities requirement by putting private land on private property, which is one reason behind our open space challenge. We need to ensure that local capital improvement plans support green network plans. And finally, we need to leverage other federal, state, and private resources. You can find a copy of this presentation if you're interested on the Neighborspace website. Join our email list from the bottom of that same page and email me as shown. That's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Barbara. This is great. It's really, I learned a lot from this, and I'm sure we all did. So we have a question from the chat. If you would comment, please, on the urban/rural demarcation lines, which is something that Maryland counties have adopted. It preserves open space, but it directs development to the inner suburbs. Would you comment on that? And also how, I mean, the person who posted didn't say how many counties have signed on. If you could give us a little background about this, that'd be helpful.
Sure. Well, actually, Baltimore County is unique in having an urban-rural demarcation line. The history there is that back in the late 60s, when the development, the Beltway was being, discussed, the folks living out in Green Spring Valley got very nervous, as many people did around the country that were in suburban areas, and formed the Valley's Planning Council. And it's the first land use group I've ever seen that hired a landscape architect before they hired a lawyer. And they hired a famous landscape architect by the name of Ian McHarg. And Ian McHarg came out and studied the landscape and said, look, if you don't want dysentery, cholera, and all kinds of other epidemics in your region, do not sewer the valleys, right? Because the valleys that are outside of the city are deeply laden with rich aquifers that feed the local reservoirs. So Pretty Boy and Loch Raven and Liberty. And so they're the source of the region's drinking water supply. So this, believe it or not, and at this time, the other thing that's really unbelievable is that the county executive was Spiro Agnew. not known to be the most honest and upstanding of folks. And he listened to this and with the support of the county council, implemented this urban-rural demarcation line, which basically delineates the public water and sewer infrastructure in the county. It's been in place since 1967 and has moved very, very little. So that's the history behind the URL. What we do have in Maryland that does sort of control where new development goes is this concept of priority funding areas. And so every jurisdiction has to delineate its priority funding areas in order to get state money for infrastructure support with new development. So in Baltimore County, we did it a long time ago before it was ever required with the implementation of the URL. Our priority funding area is the entire area that lies inside the URL. And that's home to 90% of the county's population, believe it or not, which is why there are more people in the inner ring that surrounds Baltimore City than live in the city itself.
Well, thank you. Could you comment on the tree? There's a lot of effort going on in the city of Baltimore, and I'm sure in many other places, to increase the tree canopy, which could include putting more trees in front of cultural resources or in parks, but it also includes just taking ordinary residential blocks and beefing up the tree canopy. And can you talk about how that effort fits in with increasing the amount of green space? How do they connect, or do they?
Yeah, sure. Well, in this, when we talk about these green networks, if we're going to get everyone to quality open space within a 10-minute walk, we need to think about connectors, right? And so those connectors need to be places that are, walkable. And just having a sidewalk does not make something walkable. I mean, in Baltimore County, just having a sidewalk is, often, we say it's a real blessing because the sidewalk, you can go along and the sidewalk is just not there anymore. But But to make a place walkable, you really do need tree canopy. If you've ever been along Joppa Road between Lochraven Boulevard and Towson, it's one long barren stretch that does have sidewalks on either side, but there are no trees, right? That is not a walkable place. And the county has talked about, like it has along many of those arterials, redeveloping those places with mixed use. So putting in apartments and other kinds of housing along with new commercial development. But that's a great idea, but you're going to have to tree those streets or it's not going to be a great place. People are not going to get out and walk. So there is a great connection between tree canopy and green networks. They are absolutely essential.
Thank you. And we have a question from the chat. How do the metro and the possible red line fit into these pictures of green space?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a great concept called transit-oriented development. And part of doing transit-oriented development well includes thinking about, okay, where are the transit hubs and how are they connected to other things? And can you get from these transit hubs to parks? And can you get from the transit hubs to the green networks that you're creating? One of the things I love in the presentation, there is a link to a presentation that's done by Rails to Trails. If you download it from our website, you can click on it, where they talk about how the Greenway in Baltimore City is going to be purposefully connected to mass transit, to employment centers. So the idea really is, if we're planning and doing these things well, people can easily get from where they live to all of their places of work, to mass transit, to parks. Really is designed to be kind of the connecting thread for everything in the community. But we have to plan well for that to happen.
So a couple of questions come up in the chat. Are there any organizations working on trail systems in Baltimore County? I know, just because I have relatives in Catonsville and I've been on part of the Rail to Trail there, that's very actively going on. But besides the effort in Catonsville, are there similar sort of efforts going on around the county? And then in terms of the city, we do have some green space, we're fortunate. But how efficient is it? And how much of the city population does it reach?
Yeah, well, first to the question about the county. So there is the Catonsville Rails to Trails group, which has done yeoman's work to identify and reclaim the old streetcar trails in Catonsville. But there is also a small group. In fact, I meet with them periodically, that's looking to connect the Jones Falls Trail to the Torrey Brown Trail, which you may know is up and around, starts around Cockeysville and goes to Pennsylvania. But beyond that, there's really not a robust trail effort. There is the trail that I started the presentation with that we're working on down in Dundalk, which is a spur of the National Star Spangled Banner Historic Trail. But that's the problem, right? We do not have, the only way that currently that Baltimore County acquires land for trails is in the development process. If a piece of land has a mapped greenway on it already, then the developer is required to dedicate that land to the county. But there's really no other systematic way, especially in the county's budget, that it acquires land for trails, which is a problem.
So thinking about Baltimore City's existing green space, I mean, we have this network of parks, some like Patterson Park, and quite large. But is this really efficient the way we have parks here and there that are quite large, but not that many? And how much of the city population does it reach?
I can't speak to the question of how many it reaches, but that is one of the goals of this Rails to Trails Greenway plan. And it's one of the goals of the city's really robust green network plan, which if you haven't looked at it, there is a link to the green network plan also in the presentation. If you download it, I think it's just a fabulous piece of work, thoughtful. And the idea really behind all of these networks is to look at the existing parks, right, like Patterson Park, and make sure that they are accessible to people around them if they aren't already, right? It's the whole idea that I was talking about earlier about if all that exists to get a nearby neighborhood to Patterson Park is a sidewalk that has no trees, then that's probably the sidewalk where we want to think about planting the trees. So the idea, this whole green network idea, and certainly the idea that Rails to Trails is putting forth in their Greenway plan, is to make sure that these places are connected, and that maybe you can't walk to them, you can bike to them, but that they are accessible to a large number of people. And I believe the statistic that's quoted in the presentation by Rails to Trails is that the Greenway will connect 75 neighborhoods in the city, to within 15 minutes of a quality green space. And I think the Green Network Plan in total, which has got a lot more subtle nuances than this, just this Greenway, really does have the 10-minute walk in mind, so that every city resident will be within a 10-minute walk of a quality open space at the end, whether that's an existing park like Patterson Park or, a new open space. Because when we look at open space, at least I can speak for Neighborspace, we're looking not just at unbuilt green space, but we're also looking at unbuilt pervious land. So this could be, a parking lot, for example, that might be regreened to create a pocket park that may be along a greenway.
So I want to switch the conversation for a minute away from our local areas to kind of the larger problem of global warming. So obviously, we know that there are huge environmental issues, and at the same time, we're talking here about really very local livability issues. But is there a connection between making our cities and our inner suburbs more livable to the bigger issue, the biggest issue of the environment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because I think, one aspect of this issue of global warming has to do with how much impervious surface there is in urban areas. If you think about what happened when suburbs were settled in particular, and all of a sudden we have beltways, and all of a sudden people don't really need to go downtown to do their shopping. And so we have these huge urban malls that are built. And I'm involved recently with a group that's interested in redeveloping Security Square Mall. Well, if you go over to Security Square Mall and you stand in the middle of that parking lot, it's almost as if you can see nothing for miles but impervious surface. And that creates an urban heat island effect. It raises the temperature of everything around it. It also creates just oceans of stormwater in a place, at least we're talking about Security Square, where the watershed is already in really, really bad shape. The watershed over there is one of the worst in Baltimore County, which has terrible impacts, mostly because of uncontrolled stormwater runoff, which contains sediment, that gets into the nearest tributary and ultimately into the bay, with all the impacts that go along with, water that's polluted. So this whole question of global warming is definitely driven by how we've chosen to develop and by the amount of impervious surface that we've created, which has, again, the urban heat island effect, raising the temperature of everything around it, and also these terrible, terrible effects on water quality.
Yeah. Could you, you've talked about the county, Baltimore County government and its plans, but could you talk more generally about how the federal government, the state government, and local governments impact the development of the green spaces? For example, is the federal government providing any funds for this? So how, because it seems like there's just so many jurisdictions going on here, and how do they come together or not come together to facilitate development of green spaces?
Well, there's a saying in land use law that all land use control is local, right? And that's true for the most part in Maryland. The local jurisdictions have a lot to say, pretty much all to say, in terms of what happens with land use. Now, that's not, I don't want to overgeneralize. The state has its visions about smart growth that the jurisdictions are supposed to address in their comprehensive master plans. But there's really no teeth other than the fact that comprehensive plans, development is supposed to align with comprehensive plans. But there's a lot of legal wiggle room when it comes to development that happens in priority funding areas. So in Maryland, there's not a lot of state control. Certainly at the federal level, there's the Clean Water Act, which is why we have this concern locally about the stream diet, otherwise known as the total maximum daily load, or TMDL, that everyone has to live up to. And so that is a controlling factor when it comes to stormwater. But really, the land use and these questions of where open space gets created are local issues. Land trusts can do so much. Neighborspace can, as a land trust, can ask people to donate their land and put an easement on it and protect it forever, or hold it in fee and protect it forever. Or we can buy land, although land is expensive and it's hard for us to purchase land for protection purposes. So we really are in this region dependent on local governments to do the right thing. Now, there are places across the country, I think, that are models that we could follow where states have actually implemented regulations requiring, for example, that all development pay an impact fee that goes to the production of or the protection and acquisition of land for public open space. Maryland's not one of those places, but I think we might want to consider it given how densely and quickly we've developed.
So we had a question about going back to Security Square. Is it privately owned? And if it is, shouldn't there be some penalties for the, I assume this refers to the impact on water, certainly on water quality.
Yeah, it is privately owned. There are, as is true with a lot of malls, there are multiple owners who don't see eye to eye at the moment, which is making plans to redevelop it difficult. And there are penalties for sure for not, complying with stormwater regulations on site. And I think they've probably been cited. But the challenge is there's just so much water, right? And it's hard to often pinpoint exactly where it's coming from. That is why these, a point source of pollution, like a particular factory, where you can actually see that, there's a pipe coming out of the factory, and you can measure how much pollution is coming out of that pipe, is an easier thing to deal with than a place like Security Square, where it's just a parking lot, right? It's hard to measure because the parking lot is so huge and it's rolling in so many different places. That's called a non-point source of pollution, and that's a hard thing to get your arms around in terms of, actually determining what part of the impact to the tributaries around that mall is actually owing to Security Square versus some neighborhood that has a lot of impervious surface.
Wow. And we have another question on the chat. Has there been any discussion of planting trees on public school campuses in Baltimore?
I know that Blue Water Baltimore does a lot of tree planting, I think, on public schools. I know they've done a lot of implementation of green infrastructure, of rain gardens and vegetated swales and things of that nature on public school land. But I can't speak to what's happened in the city as much as I could with what's happened in Baltimore County.
Is there an effort to plant trees on city streets that are not park spaces? Because I know, for instance, there's tree planting going on. The Baltimore Tree Trust, which is a nonprofit, is also planting. At this point, they're in East Baltimore. But is there something similar going on in the county where it's not a park, but things like public schools and residential streets, are trees being put up?
Absolutely. A lot of trees are being planted. There's a very active group, the Green Towson Alliance. I think some of their representatives are on the call, that has been engaged in lots of tree planting in and around Towson. The county government has a 40% tree canopy goal inside the Erdl, and a program called, I think it's called Backyard Trees, where if you have enough room, if you can plant 20 trees, the county will come out and plant those trees for you. Wow. And certainly there are some efforts to green up our neighborhoods with trees where that's possible. This is, again, because of the age of the infrastructure. There are a lot of utility lines along sidewalks that limit the tree planting that can be done. And so that is a challenge.
Well, Barbara, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time, and it's so interesting. And you've given us so much background to think about and links to check out. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.